Hari Om Tat Sat. Welcome to Swami Jyotirmayananda Society, our journey to self-realization. Please subscribe for the mystical meanings and to enjoy daily satsang with us. We are currently exploring the book Mystery of the Soul, Katha Upanishad, commentaries by Swami Jyotirmayananda Maharaj, narrated by myself, Swami Nikhilananda. We are currently on chapter 2, section 2, mantra number 11, where Lord of Death, Yama, continues to impart profound wisdom to his beloved disciple Nachiketa, who is but 5 years of age, physical age, mental age, and his Atma's age is timeless. But mantra 11, the sun illumines the universe and is unaffected by the defects of the eyes of the various creatures. In the same way, the innermost self of all beings is one and all pervading and is unaffected by the miseries of the world. These are simple illustrations to show that the self assumes different forms, interprets them, and pervades them, penetrates them, and at the same time remains unaffected by them. That is why it is difficult to comprehend and understand such a wondrous thing. The diversities of objects are illusory in nature. Just as fire and air exist in different forms according to the forms of the objects they pervade, so the self exists in different forms. At the same time, however, though pervading all the forms, the self remains unaffected and detached. Such is its power. The illustrations of the sun further make it clear that the self is the knower and revealer of all objects but is unaffected by them. In brief, the innermost self is the absolute reality, one without a second, the substratum and essence of all that exists, the individual soul that continues to incarnate from one body to another, realizes its identity with the Supreme Self when the veil of ignorance is destroyed by intuitional knowledge or pragya. Mantra number 12, the Divine Self is one, the controller of all living beings, the indweller in all hearts. He manifests his own non dual form into the multiplicity of the world process. Those spiritual aspirants who perceive the self within themselves attain the eternal bliss and not others. A spiritual aspirant endowed with the qualification for attaining self-realization is called a Dhira. Dhira is a hero, a veritable hero in the battle of life. He practices discrimination, dispassion, purity of mind and body, contentment, faith, and endurance in order to gain an understanding, insight into the teachings of his spiritual preceptor or guru. Endowed with these excellent qualities, he is able to understand the subtleties about the self, and thus, guided by his guru, he beholds the self within his own heart. Such is the magical journey between the guru and the disciple, where they both patiently enter the realm of the self. Vidya, Atma Vidya, knowledge of the self. Happiness that is experienced through the objects of the world is limited and restricted by external conditions. Such happiness has a beginning and an end. Further, it is illusory because it is the bliss of the self that is imposed on the objects through the desires of the mind. When a desire is fulfilled, the tension of the mind is temporarily released. The bliss of self shines forth within oneself. Due to ignorance, one believes that happiness was experienced through the instrumentality of the objects by coming in contact with them. But this erroneous belief becomes the basis for increased raga or attachment. That's why we like them, we want to do more and more of them. Reality is completely opposite. The joy is coming from within, not from the object. When the self is realized through intuitive vision, the illusion of desire, multiple desires, is dispelled. Bliss is experienced without any restriction or limitation. The bliss of the self is eternal and unconditional. But as long as the self is not realized, the individual soul continues to run after the mirage of pleasures in the arid desert of the painful world process. Mantra number 13. The eternal among the conditioned eternals, the consciousness of all conscious principles, though being one, causes the satisfaction of the desires in the many souls. That supreme self is perceived by the spiritual heroes within their own hearts, and therefore they are called heroes, because they have to fight this battle to see the self within. They indeed attain supreme peace and not others. They are the ones who come out victorious. Just as the rising sun dispels the darkness of the night, so the intuitive vision of the self destroys the darkness of ignorance, avidya. With the removal of ignorance, the desires that keep the mind agitated are dissolved. Until then, desires and their subtle forms continue to obstruct the divine melody of the self. Overpowered by ignorance, people seek peace and comfort through the objects of the world. But true peace proceeds only from the self. How profound is this knowledge? In the state of self realization, one experiences boundless bliss, boundless, infinite. It's called bhuma. Others who are not in the possession of self realization continue to wander in the world of conditioned peace and happiness. In fact, peace and happiness that arise out of dependence are expressions of pain and restlessness. Mantra number 14. The wise consider the self indescribable, beyond all descriptions, the very embodiment of supreme bliss. How am I to know that self? How does that self shine forth? How is the self experienced? This mantra explains that the bliss of the self is beyond words. Even the pleasures of objects cannot be adequately expressed by a person. So, how could the bliss of self be described through the media of limited words and finite concepts of the mind? The bliss of self is different from the pleasures of the senses. Due to ignorance, the individual soul becomes identified with the outgoing functions of the mind. Burdened by desire, the mind conceives of happiness in the objects of the world, and the soul, identified with that vritti or that thought wave, seems to derive pleasure from the senses. However, an object is pleasurable only as long as the pressure of desire exists in the mind. When the desire is temporarily fulfilled, the same object is unable to produce happiness. Practical example: you're very hungry, cannot wait to eat food. And as you eat the food, you start getting full. The same food you are no longer interested in, that you were starving for. Suppose you're forced to eat it, you don't have a choice, somebody is forcing you to eat it. The same object, the same food that you relish so much becomes a cause of pain to you. If you're forced to eat the more and more, eventually you will vomit it out. You can't see that food anymore. Same object, same things. The quantity was after your desire had ended. and therefore it became painful. So, a very simple practical example you can relate to. So, with this, we conclude our satsanga and we will continue from mantra number 14 in tomorrow's satsang. This is Swami Nikhilananda signing off. Hari Om Tat Sat. Divine blessings.